Good morning. The focus of my talk today is about seasonal malaria chemoprevention. After a bit of a background about this, I'll tell the story of an MSF project in the Sahel and use it as an example to set the stage for a broader discussion of SMC. So first, a little background. Malaria is a major global health challenge. In 2015, it was estimated that there were over 200 million cases and 500,000 deaths due to malaria, with 90% of those coming in sub-Saharan Africa. And these are massive numbers, but nonetheless a big global improvement in the last 15 years. But the decreases aren't the same everywhere, and one of the worst affected regions remains the Sahel, which is the area we'll be discussing today. So when it comes to chemoprevention, there's a lot of different programs and a lot of different initials that are thrown around. So before we go too far, I just want to try and clarify a little bit. 3 have well-defined conditions and WHO recommendations. So an intermittent preventive treatment for infants and for pregnant women, single doses of sulfadoxine pyrimethamine, or Fansidar, or SP, are given either at routine vaccination visits or during routine antenatal care. SMC we'll get into more in a bit. IPTC is a generic term. It's used to describe many different things, but in general it includes school-aged children. And both SP-based regimens and ACT-based regimens are used. In mass drug administrations, the entire population is given an antimalarial. But there's no clear consensus or guidelines about when or where these last two strategies should be used. But despite the different acronyms, the overall premise is the same. We use medicine to treat asymptomatic infections and provide a prophylactic benefit for a few weeks at the same time. So SMC is targeted in the dark areas here in the Sahel, where malaria transmission is highly seasonal during the rains, which come between July and October, November. Areas with the cooler colors here in Central Africa have much longer transmission seasons and therefore are not targeted by SMC. Children aged 3 to 59 months are given 2 medicines, sulfadoxine pyrimethamine, the SP, and amidiaquin, or AQ. They're given these medicines once a month, up to 4 months. The single dose of SP and the first dose of amidiaquin are taken together, and then doses of amidiaquin are taken once a day for the next 2 days. And as you can imagine, there's lots of different delivery mechanisms and operational strategies possible. The trials underpinning SMC were performed in the 1990s and the early 2000s, and they suggest about a 75% decrease in malaria incidence among children taking SMC as we currently give it. The formal WHO recommendation about SMC was made in 2012, which is the same year that MSF began implementing. MSF was the first major program-level implementer in the Sahel. And for the last couple of years, a lot of new actors have started coming on board. The largest is a UNITAID-funded consortium called Access SMC, which has been responsible for implementing SMC in the areas in red on this map. And with scale-up has come increased efficiencies. The overall unit cost of SMC has fallen to just over $1 per child per distribution. So that's a very basic introduction to SMC. So now I want to move to a real-world MSF program example to set the stage. MSF has been present in Malaria, Niger since 2009. With a large-scale program that's in many ways a classic MSF program in the Sahel. Inpatient and outpatient services are offered, and community activities include vaccination and, since 2013, SMC. And despite good program coverage in the area, in 2015, there was a massive increase in activity during the malaria season. The hospital was filled way past capacity, and the blood bank could barely keep up. And a lot of questions were being asked. And using program data collected in a series of sentinel sites, our colleagues estimated actually that the effectiveness of SMC dropped off considerably with each distribution during the season, and that the medicines provided very little protection beyond 3 weeks. So we were working really hard to implement SMC well, but the hospital was still full. Why? And there were lots of hypotheses. Was it that we were seeing children who were just coming from across the border in Nigeria? Or maybe it's because children weren't taking the drugs like they were supposed to. Or maybe it was just a really bad year. But it seems like we use that excuse every year. The worst would be that there's a real problem with the effectiveness of SMC, and that could be either because of increasing resistance to the drugs, or also because of maybe host factors like malnutrition, which could lead to decreased absorption of the SMC drugs. Or the final hypothesis could actually just be that the increase that we're seeing in our hospitals is because there's better access to care. So with this example in mind, think about this program in Malaria. I'm going to lead you through a few of these questions, and a couple extra ones, and I'll try and answer as many as I can. The first is the most basic. Does SMC work in the real world? And as scale-up happens, a corollary is, how little can we do? Or how light can we make program implementation while still ensuring success? In my experience, the sentiment underlying this question is, why are our hospitals still full? And then, should we consider expanding the target age? And should we consider expanding the season? And what about resistance? What's the impact of giving millions of doses of SP and AQ on the development of anti-malarial resistance? Then what about the idea of a rebound effect once children are too old for SMC? Is SMC cost effective? And lastly, should we be considering using different molecules or combining SMC with other strategies to decrease malaria transmission? So, does SMC work? To answer this question, we performed a prospective case control study during the 2016 season in Malaria. We wanted to estimate the individual level protectiveness of taking SMC against developing malaria. And we did this in two different areas. One, where the first dose of SP and AQ was directly observed. This means that a child comes to the distribution site, a health worker gives them the first dose of SP and the dose of SP and the first dose of AQ. The child stays at the site, we make sure they don't vomit, and then the child goes home. We give a blister pack containing the 2 other doses of amidiaquin to the child's caretaker with instructions on how to give them the next 2 days at home. In the other zone, SMC was not directly observed. Distribution sites were set up and children came, but no medicine was administered on site. Patients went home with the complete blister pack of doses of SP and AQ with instructions on how to give them at home. So we defined clinical malaria as a child with a fever and a positive malaria rapid test. And lab-confirmed malaria was a child with clinical malaria with parasitemia on microscopy. All of our controls were age-matched. We enrolled 3 community controls on the same day as the enrollment of the case from the same village as the case. And we enrolled 3 health center controls from the same health center over the course of the next 72 hours. In total, our target sample size was about 4,000 children, and we enrolled them prospectively throughout the 4-month SMC season. We collected a large amount of information about all the participants, and all of our estimates of the effectiveness that I'll show have been controlled for these factors. And from each participant, we took 2 slides for microscopy and a small amount of blood. Now, just to give you an idea, this is the map of the villages of origin of cases. A couple of things, it covers a very large area, and you can see this is the border with northern Nigeria. And here are the main results of our study. In the whole area, both DOT and non-DOT, if we only consider children who have a card that proved they received SMC, the effectiveness was 85%, which is really good. But when we add children who didn't have a card, but whose parents said that they had received it, the effectiveness drops to 50%. And this brings up a lot of questions. One of which is whether the parents who didn't have a card were actually telling the truth. Now, comparing the dot zone to the non-dot zone, there were some very important differences. When we look at card-proven receipt of SMC, the effectiveness of SMC in the dot zone was 97%, while in the non-dot zone, it was only 60. When we add in the children who didn't have a card in the dot zone, the effectiveness remains very high at 89%. But in the non-dot zone, it drops to 21%, with confidence intervals that cross the null value, meaning that it might not have even been protective. Importantly, there were no significant differences in the effectiveness of SMC by age, sex, or nutritional status. Now, on the whole, these results are highly reassuring that SMC works when we know that children have taken at least the first dose of SP and the first dose of AQ. But they raise many questions around adherence to treatment at home. And this figure shows the effectiveness of SMC with each of the 4 distributions over the season. So here you have the August, September, October, well, July, August, September, October. And you see the effectiveness was quite high throughout. There were no differences between the distributions, and there was none of the drop-off that we had feared. And the second figure shows the effectiveness over time. So in the first week after any SMC distribution, in the second week after any SMC distribution, in the third week after any SMC distribution. So it suggests a high level of protection for 4 weeks after any distribution, which is even higher than we'd expected. So I've only finished my first question, but the results I've shown mean that I need to add another one. Do children take SMC like they're supposed to? And no one really knows. Short of taking spy cameras into someone's home, the best way to judge would be to measure levels of amidiaquin in the blood. But unfortunately, there's no standard benchmark data that shows how levels of amidiaquin change over time. So in Malaria last season, we aimed to fix that problem by conducting a population pharmacokinetic study. We gave SP and AQ under ideal conditions where we observed each 3 doses by a healthcare worker in the children's homes, and then we did a series of blood draw on these children over the next 6 weeks. And we just received the crude results 2 days ago. And these data points here show the amidiaquin levels under ideal conditions over time. What we'll do is we'll fix a curve, and we'll be able to say what the blood level of amidiaquin should be at any given time if amidiaquin is taken correctly. And we'll use this curve to judge the samples of the children in our case control study. And there's more work to be done, but the crude levels are extremely telling. So in the population pharmacokinetic study that I just described, all participants had detectable levels of amidiaquin even 6 weeks after the administration. But when we look at the children in our case control study, looking only at children whose parents described correct adherence at home, in the DOT zone, 25% of children had undetectable levels of amidiaquin. And in the non-dot zone, this proportion rises to almost 50%. So many children are obviously not taking medicines like they should. So to get back to our original question, yes, SMC works, but so we showed good protection for 4 weeks and throughout the season, but our results show the potential problems of trying to make the intervention easier to implement. The effectiveness in the non-dot zone was significantly lower than the effectiveness in the dot zone, likely due to non-adherence. And even in the dot zone, adherence was clearly imperfect. So this brings up a larger question. SMC works at an individual level as long as the children are taking the medicines. But we've seen variable quality of the scaling up of SMC across the Sahel. And MSF isn't really on the front line of implementing SMC that much anymore. But we're still on the front line of curative care in the areas where SMC is implemented. So the quality of these SMC implementations will continue to have an impact, obviously, on the children who receive it, but also on our facilities. So, next question. Should we be including older children in SMC? And to answer the question, at least for Malaria, we performed 2 malaria prevalence surveys last year, looking at 3 different age groups: children under 5 who receive SMC, children aged 5 to 9 years, and children aged 10 years and above. We did the first during the high season, just prior to a final SMC distribution, and then the second at the end of December, when the low season was supposed to have started. The high season survey shows that the prevalence of parasitemia was actually highest in children aged 5 to 9 years. Nonetheless, as we'd expect, the parasite density was highest in the youngest children. When we repeated the survey in the supposed low season, we were surprised to see that the prevalence of parasitemia remained just about the same, following all the same patterns, although the parasite density in the blood was significantly lower in all groups. But overall, we see that there's a large segment of the population, these 5 to 9-year-olds, who have a high parasite burden, but who aren't eligible for SMC. So should we expand SMC? Our survey data certainly give evidence to support it. And it's already been tested in Senegal. So in this trial, SMC was given to all children under 10. And what's really interesting to note is that when SMC was given in this expanded age group, not only were the children who took SMC protected, but because they had eliminated a larger proportion of the overall parasite reservoir in the community, there were significant indirect benefits even for the older children and adults. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting we go rush out and expand SMC everywhere. For starters, no one is currently even making SP and AQ at the doses that we would need to give to these 5 to 9-year-old children. And certainly adding to the logistical burden of SMCs wouldn't be easy, but these older children maybe are easier to reach using school-based strategies. And what about doing more rounds of SMC? For this one, the short answer is I don't think that we have any evidence to support or not support it. All of the original trials of SMC were done over a 3-month period. And so then when the ultimate decision was made about the recommendation, it just came down to the fact that the experts were comfortable recommending 1 month more than what the trial showed, but not more than that. Different modeling studies have shown that suggested that expanding could be effective. But to my knowledge, no one has actually ever tried it. And what about resistance? Now this could take up an entire presentation, so I'll try and be concise. First of all, resistance is most reliably measured in efficacy studies. But because these studies are difficult to implement, we often look at the prevalence of molecular markers of resistance to different antimalarials. And these markers on the parasite's genome are imperfectly linked to in vivo resistance. Furthermore, we know that the prevalence of these markers varies greatly over time and space. There's natural variations in the parasite populations. So obviously, giving lots of a drug on a population will have an effect, but single-point cross-sectional studies should be interpreted with great caution. And lastly, another important point is that although we look for molecular markers of resistance to SP and AQ, there's no defined guidance as to what to do with the results. For IPT in pregnant women, it's recommended everywhere, regardless of the prevalence of markers of resistance to SP, because of documented benefits to the fetus and to the mother. But for IPT in infants, for example, SP is no longer recommended, where the prevalence of the mutations to SP is over 50%. There's no clear guidance on what to do for SMC. So in 2015, we performed one of these cross-sectional studies that I just described in Malaria, and it showed that the prevalence of what I'll call the worst mutation to SP was about 7%. But that all of the samples with this mutation were in the period just following an SMC distribution, and that after a couple weeks, these parasites weren't present anymore. So this was considered a largely reassuring result. And we performed other similar studies in different places across the Sahel, in Chad, in Mali, and Niger. And the results are broadly similar. But like I said, relying on 1 or 2 studies isn't enough, and we need to be looking at the overall picture. And the good news is that monitoring these markers has been a part of the evaluation of Access SMC. But as that program and that funding runs out, I'm not aware of any systematic strategy or funder for monitoring resistance markers in the Sahel. The rebound effect. what do I mean when I talk about the rebound effect? A lot of people talk about this. I'm talking about the idea that children who are well protected against malaria while they're taking SMC suddenly become more vulnerable once they turn 5 and graduate from the program. And the short answer is yes, there will almost certainly be a rebound effect. But to know how big it will be, we would also have to know what the baseline risks of malaria are in these 5 to 6-year-olds. And these data are not as easy to come by as one might think. And what data we do have are fraught with problems, not least of which because access to care for this older age group is very different from the younger. So to illustrate what I'm talking about, let's take this generic graph. On the y-axis is a child's risk of malaria, and on the x-axis is time. This green line shows what happens naturally. As a child gets older, he or she develops greater natural immunity after infections and after natural exposure to the malaria parasite. So her risk of malaria becomes lower with time. Now, let's imagine that we put in place a preventive intervention aimed at providing further protection than the natural immunity that the child acquires. And this could be anything. This could be bed nets, this could be SMC. This purple line represents a child who receives this intervention. During the time that the intervention is in place, the child's risk of malaria is much lower than the first child. And then after the intervention is taken away, we see that this child's risk does indeed become much higher. Because by giving the intervention, we artificially impaired the acquisition of natural immunity. But not totally, because our intervention wasn't perfect. And then over time, the child's risk of malaria approaches the risk of a normal child. So looking at the curves, we can say that this area is the overall benefit of the protective intervention, and that this difference is the rebound due to the intervention. And in this case, it's a significant rebound. Right? You can see here that at certain points, the risk of malaria is almost double compared to a child that didn't receive the intervention. But the overall benefit is still much larger than the rebound. And the absolute risk, even if we take it double here in this period, the absolute risk is not that high, because the child was still developing some natural immunity along the way. So what happens with a less effective intervention? Well, the risk of malaria decreases, but to a much lesser degree. So the overall benefit is less, and the rebound is actually much lower, almost nothing. And then taken to the other extreme, what happens if the intervention is highly effective? In this case, imagine an intervention nearly 100% effective at preventing malaria. Here, we almost eliminate the risk of malaria over time. And as soon as we remove the intervention, the rebound is massive. And the risk of malaria is almost as high as when we started, when the child was very young. So in this case, the benefit is huge, but the risk at an older age is very high. So where do we stand with rebound and SMC? Which of these three curves is it? Well, I'm not sure that anyone knows, and the magnitudes that I've shown you are hypothetical, just to illustrate. But with the evidence I've shown you about the effectiveness, I'm pretty sure that we're not talking about 100% protective effectiveness, like in this bottom graph. So I think in scaled up real-world conditions, we're probably somewhere between these two on the top. Yes, there's a real measurable rebound effect after SMC is taken away, but one whose overall size is still much less than the protective benefit of giving SMC. Next, is SMC cost effective? Is it worth it? No, so first of all, this depends on how you defend, is it effective? How you define, is it effective? Are we talking about all-cause malaria? Are we talking about deaths? Are we talking about transfusions in the blood bank? And these are all difficult to measure. But what I can say is that given the overall levels of effectiveness from the studies I've shown you, as well as the significantly lower costs associated with implementing SMC now, it's likely that SMC is cost effective. And health economists are working on this question, and hopefully we'll have some hard numbers to show in the near future. But I do believe that given we've shown that SMC is effective and the cost is still relatively low, we're looking at a favorable profile. Okay, last one. I've heard lots of discussion about trying to do new things with SMC. And lots of MSF projects have added great things like vaccination and nutritional screening to their SMC programs. And that's really great. We need to be doing that. It's a great way to get to children. But when I'm talking about new strategies here, I mean new malaria control strategies together with SMC. So one of the most commonly discussed is the use of first-line ACTs for SMC. Drugs like DHA piperacin, well, they could be very beneficial because they have a longer protective effect, 4 to 6 weeks. And some other groups are actually trying this right now in a trial in Burkina Faso. Another possibility could be the introduction of ivermectin, which is really the it molecule of the moment. It's gaining a lot of interest. So what happens is when a whole community takes a dose of ivermectin all at the same time, it actually has a mosquitocidal effect. And a growing body of small-scale studies shown that this actually works to prevent malaria transmission. Now, you can't give ivermectin to children under 5, but you could imagine doing a setup where you have a community-wide distribution where children under 5 come and they get their SMC, and everyone else gets ivermectin with a potential synergistic effect. And lastly, something I really believe in is the use of malaria vaccines in this context. Now, as you may know, the most promising vaccine thus far is far from ideal for a number of reasons. And it only confers protection for a short period. But in an area like the Sahel, where the transmission is so highly seasonal, you could imagine giving the primary series necessary when the child is young, and then giving a booster every year at the beginning of the malaria season. So this strategy is actually going to be undergoing a trial, placebo-controlled with and without SMC, in Burkina Faso and Mali over the next 3 years. Super interesting stuff. So I'd like to come back to this list of questions just for a second. There's a whole lot there, and I've covered a lot in a very short time. But these are the questions that I've heard repeatedly over the last few years as SMC has been ramped up in MSF. And it's true, some of these we don't have great answers for. But one thing that I'd like to emphasize is, despite the fact these questions are always being asked, we actually have pretty good answers to many of them. So in conclusion, I'd like to say one more time that it was really MSF that led the way with implementing SMC. MSF is now largely handing off to other actors. But as this happens, we're going to still be there in the Sahel. With these new implementers, well, it means that we may have new challenges with implementation, and that we in the field will continue to be on the front line of curative care if SMC is not done well. But despite some misgivings, if there's one thing I want you to take away, it's that SMC works. And I've shown you a lot of ways that implementation strategies have a major impact on its effectiveness. And just think about this adherence data that I showed you. But overall, it works. Nonetheless, because of the massive burden of malaria in the Sahel, SMC alone is clearly not enough. And that's evident when you look at the Malaria hospital. And that's why we need to keep innovating, to try new strategies, to try ivermectin, to try a malaria vaccine, either this imperfect one or maybe a new second-generation vaccine. Because if we want to tackle malaria in the Sahel, we're going to have to do more. Thank you very much for your attention.